I wanted to sort of write down some things I've been thinking about with regard to replacing Laminas-MVC. This is a combination of things I've been wanting to do anyway, things that are now strictly necessary, and all intended to be informed by what worked in our database transition to doctrine. So hopefully it will be the road to a proposal we can all get behind. So first of all, before we talk about what we're going to do, let's talk about what's wrong with our current state of affairs so we can feel good about changing it. First of all, in controllers, dependency management is a mess. Uh, a lot of things rely on utility methods inherited from base classes, which is just kind of murky. And those utility methods, as well as lots of other code, is just pulling services directly out of service managers. So instead of injecting dependencies properly, we're pulling things sort of out of global spaces, which is messy. Um, and it's really hard to fix that because the way Laminas MVC controllers work, we have all these actions bundled into classes. You can potentially have entirely different dependencies for different methods of the class, and injecting everything at once is just unwieldy and potentially expensive. And this whole situation makes it hard to write tests. It makes static analysis unreliable, and it's just annoying in principle because it feels like a non-clean design, and I don't like it. Additionally, there are framework-specific details that make everything kind of rigid. One thing that's been on the roadmap to get rid of, but we've never gotten around to getting rid of it, is controller plugins, which work by magic. As you may have seen, you just sort of call a non-existent method and it magically loads a plugin. And yeah, it's not clear. Again, it's not easy to statically analyze. I think we have some weird comments to tell the code how to interpret it. I don't like it. And of course, we use framework-specific classes and interfaces throughout the controllers because that's how Laminas MVC works. So we are locked into Laminas view models. We are locked into Laminas HTTP responses. All of that makes things more rigid than would be good. So I have a general proposal. I'm calling it actions and action bundles. Those are probably terrible names. I encourage you to correct me, but that's what I'm going to call them for the purposes of today. The idea here is that in the current system, our router determines a controller and an action. We load a controller class we call an action method. I've already talked about some of the disadvantages of that approach, though it also has advantages. So I'm looking at sort of a hybrid solution. What if we had a plugin manager, which I'm going to call the action loader, and we had some logic that once we've resolved what the controller and action should be, it tries to fetch a server called a service called controller slash action, which could resolve to a class containing an action method. If there's no such service defined, it just pulls the controller and gets the action out of there. So uh, these classes could still work just like current controllers in terms of having convention-based method names. You know, action is the method name. Um, but I'm looking at a more granular breakdown of how these things are arranged. And the other important thing is that these classes that we're defining ourselves could have more generic inputs and outputs to make them framework agnostic. So why do this? Um, First of all, having this more granular approach to breaking down and organizing actions reduces the dependency problem without losing the advantages of our current controllers. So if you have an action that has specific heavy dependencies that are expensive to construct, you can put it in its own class and inject those things through the constructor, and it stands alone and is easy to understand. But if you have a group of related actions that should go together, or if you want to be able to use inheritance to have variations of those actions, you can still bundle them together into a single class, just like we do in our current controllers for search and record functionality. None of that organizational logic needs to change. And then the other beautiful thing is that we can create a Laminas controller with a magic call method that translates. So this could spin up the action loader based on the class name and the action being called. We construct the service we need to pull out of the action framework. We translate the Laminas inputs into our generic inputs. We translate the actions output into specific Laminas outputs, and everything still works the same way it currently does. So we can begin refactoring piecemeal without breaking the whole application. And the result is better organized, clearer, less entangled code. But of course, if this general approach sounds good, there's still some decisions to make. One important one being what exactly are the inputs and outputs for our actions? You know, we need to cover the same input use cases that Laminas currently has. So, get and post, route parameters, server parameters. Um, and outputs, again, need to cover the same range as the current Laminas setup. So we need to be able to return both an HTTP response that has an immediate effect or a set of parameters that can be used to render views. Another important decision, of course, what framework are we going to be using? But the advantage to my proposal is that it gives us time to evaluate a few different things. Nonetheless, knowing what we're heading toward could inform our general low-level design. So making some decisions sooner rather than later would be helpful. Um, I'm also getting some background noise. Oh, there we go. I just muted someone. I apologize. Um, Finally, another thing to think about is where do we want to put this work? Is there a particular branch we should be targeting? Is there a particular release we should be targeting? Because that could influence our strategy somewhat. So let me move from questions to a broad proposal, followed by more questions. Um, so I propose that in my hypothetical action classes, the hypothetical action methods should take arrays as input. But that still raises questions. Should the method have separate parameters for get, post, route, server? Should they just take one big super array with keys for those things? Or should they just take a key value array and we delegate the act of prioritizing and merging parameters to some higher level piece of code? I could see all of these things as possible solutions. I don't know which one is best. Um, I propose that if we want an action to render a view, we just have it return an array, not an object. Um, but what should that array look like? Do we have, a layout key and a variables key, or do we just have a flat array and we reserve certain keys for special things like setting the layout? Again, I don't know what's best. Things to think about. I also propose that if we want to do HTTP stuff, there's a standard for that now. So we could use PSR7 response objects if we want to return an HTTP response, but how should we implement that? There's lots of libraries. I haven't really looked into them, so I imagine there are some decisions to make there as well. Moving on. I propose that we should view Mezio as our most likely framework destination for a few reasons. First of all, it's less opinionated than some of the other frameworks that we've talked about, like Symfony and Laravel. I've had a number of people talk to me and say, I like framework X a lot, but using that in VuFind would require drastic changes to everything. I think we should be pragmatic and not do that, especially because that just entangles us with another dependency that could become a liability in the future. I also think that the pipeline approach that Mezio uses seems reasonably compatible with my action proposal because rendering the action piece is just one step in the pipeline. It's either the last step in the pipeline if it returns a response, or it's the step before view rendering that generates the inputs for view rendering. And then, we also have to figure out what steps come before the action, things like bootstrapping. That's a whole separate refactoring project that we need to figure out. But again, that's work that could go on in parallel with this action work. It all feels compatible to me. And as I've said before, one of my main disadvantages from my limited experience with Mezio is that the configuration can get complicated and ugly. But if we have all of our action configuration sort of internal to VuFind as part of an action plugin manager, and we have relatively simple routing where everything resolves to the action manager, then I could see the Mezio configuration itself being pretty lightweight and simple, and we don't have to put a lot of energy into, mapping every single route that we currently have to a Mezio route. Um, Again, this is all designed toward the idea of let's keep our logic in our space as much as we can and lean on the framework much less than we have in the past. Um, we also need to think carefully about the scope of our next couple of releases in order to make a decision about branch strategy, as I mentioned. Obviously, we don't want to get into a situation where we're constantly creating conflicts that we have to resolve because we've refactored code in one place and now we're changing it somewhere else. So I feel like we either want to say, we're going to refactor the actions for release 11.1, or else, let's say we're not going to change a lot of controllers in 11.1 if we can possibly avoid it. Whatever features go there, maybe we add some new controllers, but we don't change what we have, things like that. Or, just do things in a conscious way. And again, I'm not proposing that we should introduce these actions in 11.1 because that doesn't feel like a minor release kind of change, but I'm not taking anything off the table yet. This is all for us to discuss. Um, but this does raise the question of, from a release perspective, do we want to have a release where we've refactored the actions, but we're still using Laminas-MVC? Or do we just want to do all of the refactoring in total for release 12? Um, but this is just the path we take to get us there. Again, I don't have strong opinions about this. Maybe it will be determined by pragmatic realities on the ground, but just something to think about. What is the scope of each release? If we go forward with this strategy, what is done and what release does what level of done correspond with? And that's it. Those are my initial thoughts. So please, I'm interested to hear what everyone thinks about it. Um, and I will open up the floor.
Uh, did I just blink, or did you not mention PSR7 as a possibility for the request parameters?
I mentioned that as a possibility for returning a response from an action. Um, I suppose it could be used for the request parameters as well. I wasn't sure if that was too restrictive though, because we also have parameters that don't come from the HTTP request.
Yeah, that might be a case. Perhaps we need our own class for easy access to parameters.
Yeah, I was proposing an array to keep it light and unstructured, but having our own class is definitely not off the table.
There
Um,
is one thing to keep in mind, that at least the OAuth 2 controller needs something to be able to turn it to a PSR7 request and back to a response. So whatever we do, let's make sure that it's compatible.
which controller was that?
OAuth 2,
Oh, yes.
because it calls the classes the library that uses PSR7.
So if we're already natively speaking PSR7, then that should just remove the step, I would hope.
Yeah, that's one thing. Now it's translating between Laminas and PSR7. But we could of course have something that's PSR7 compatible, but adds some convenience methods or something like that.
Exactly. And I see Bernd has hand up.
Yeah, regarding your question, 11.1 or 12 in the intermediate release, I think an intermediate release could be helpful for the transition. So everybody has more time to adapt their own code, their own controllers, and depending on the timeline. So what would be the timeline for 11.1?
I think that's entirely determined by how quickly we can act. Right now we're expecting 11.0 in November, so I wouldn't see an 11.1 happening before, say, May or June at the very earliest. And I would expect later than that, realistically. And I think we're sort of torn between the pressure of the fact that Laminas-MVC is going to be end of life very soon and we'll be getting screaming warnings saying stop using this, versus the fact that it's going to take time to do this correctly. So, Maccabee.
As you're presenting it, this architecture makes sense to me, um, and seems pretty, I don't know, understandable, and also a pretty smooth path from, as you say, from controller right now. As as though the abstraction meets the reality of the particular implementation, there's I still have some questions in my mind about the level of complexity and the level of abstraction. And part of why I'm saying this is the command pattern that VuFind instituted a couple of years ago. I still haven't quite wrapped my head around it, and every time I watch a search, I have to sort of like, my stack trace goes like 7 levels deep of trying to figure out exactly what caused that search, and it's just me, I know, but the controller and action model right now, although has all the problems that you said, I understand it, right? Like I can trace controller. There's the method. It's pretty clear, right? And I'm just not worrying, but I if we end up have too many sort of inside out method calls of layers of abstraction and things that are functions being passed as methods and all that stuff, we make the readability a little bit more challenging, and then just with the naming itself, the idea of actions and commands already sounds a little bit similar. And so I'm just imagining a case where we have an action calling a command, or command being called by an action, which causes a command, and my head is exploding. So
That
it all seems fine. I'm just worried about the level of complexity in reality here.
that is entirely fair, though at least the way I'm envisioning this presently is that the actions just become the new controllers, and we need to name things carefully in the short term so we can differentiate between the controllers and the actions. But in the long run, well, I mean, right now what's happening is the router resolves, and then some opaque framework code happens that triggers the controller and the action. And then, by convention, we know how to find that. And my hope is that in the long term, the router resolves, and then some more transparent code takes the output of the router and uses that to load an action. And then, as I say, the actions are the new controllers. It's just in the short term, we'll be slimming the controllers down until they go away and moving the code into a different place that's wrapped in the controllers for compatibility reasons, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, the actual migration path, as you described it, of the controllers as they are now to the actions, that makes sense to me. It's more the implementation of those actions by the actual framework, and whether that's equally sort of straightforward code or if it ends up being many layers of abstraction and bundled, like again the command parameter idea of bundling what you're going to do as an object that you're passing around, where my head starts to spin a little.
Yeah, I don't envision this being more abstract. And if we namespace the classes correctly, it will look a lot like what we currently have, except that maybe it will be more classes in a sub namespace instead of one giant unmanageable class. I'm thinking, for example, about the My Research controller, which is the bane of my existence just because of how much stuff is in there. Maybe it becomes a My Research namespace that has a whole, a request action bundle and a profile action bundle or just a profile action. And again, I'm not tied to the idea of calling anything an action bundle. I've been awake since 4:30 and this is how my brain is working right now. Um, maybe we just continue calling things controllers when we should call them controllers. And maybe an action is just a controller with only one thing in it. Um, my point is really just about this convention of not tying everything into being one giant controller full of a million actions. We also could talk about, how the routing and the actions correlate with each other because, there's kind of a one-to-one mapping right now that, maybe some of our URLs should also change, but I always try to prevent that because of the backward compatibility and confusion issues that could arise from changing anything. The other thought that occurred to me as I was giving my presentation is that my beautiful idea of using a call method to trigger the actions in a seamless way is broken somewhat by the fact that, as I mentioned, the controller plugins work by magic using a call method. I think it's still doable, but we'd have to wrap around the framework's call method and check if the method name ends in action and then do one thing else proxy back up so that the controller plugins still work, which is just ugly. But it would work. It would work.
I have a question about the with the new framework where we have something like pipelines. Are we limiting ourselves when we use that action approach, and there would be features that we actually could use with that pipeline, or yeah?
Yeah, it's not my intention to limit us. My thought is if we take this approach now, it allows us to translate the code that we currently have in a pretty smooth way. But if we find that moving more things higher up the pipeline is an improvement, there's no reason that we can't do that. Though then we do run into, more intellectual overhead, as Maccabee alludes to, because then you have to figure out, is this getting routed through a different pipeline? Is this ending up in our action resolver, etc.? But there are clearly places where having multiple pipelines could make sense. I'm thinking specifically, for example, of the Ajax controller, which just does a lot of wild stuff, completely unlike other parts of the code. And maybe we would want to have a separate pipeline for Ajax actions, um, that directly goes to the Ajax handler logic without having to wrap that in an action. Um, and there may be other cases like that as well. But I also envision there being ongoing need for these bundled types of actions for things like making it easier to create a new search backend without having to redefine a lot of independent pieces separately.
Yeah, I think it definitely makes sense to get a lot of functionality out of the controllers into something like actions. Yeah.
For me, this all makes sense. I just trying to think about the execution order and versions and things like that. It would have been really nice to have something in place already in version 11 because it's a major release. But I understand that it's not going to be possible in this
Right,
time frame.
right. Yeah, and honestly, adding yet another major re-architecting to 11.0 might be the straw that breaks the camel's back because we are already changing an awful lot of things in this release through largely through forces beyond our control in the Laminas ecosystem churn. Um, but it may end up taking a couple releases. And I also would say it seems not impossible to me that we end up with the action refactoring in 12 and a full replacement of Laminas-MVC in 13. I don't want to wait 2 years to get off a deprecated library, but we have to be realistic. This is a lot of work. Until we start it, I don't know that we know what it will take to finish it. So we'll see.
Also another question, is there a way to somehow run the old solution and the new solution in parallel, or is that not really possible? So we have time to upgrade one controller at a time and not have to do everything at once.
Well, that is the advantage to releasing the action method before we change frameworks. I think it would be difficult, though not impossible, to run Laminas MVC and Mezio at the same time. Uh, but it would not be hard at all to refactor the contents of all of our controllers and reduce the Laminas MVC core to just the translation layer. And then in the next release, replace the translation layer with a new framework. So, much the way in 10 we refactored all the database code, and then in 11 we switched to Doctrine. So that could be a strong argument for definitely making a release with the refactored code still in Laminas MVC to help with transition. And again, if we don't like that being 11.1 for semantic versioning reasons, we also could consider just having 12 and 13 closer together and explaining why we made that decision.
Yeah, that was what I was about to propose. If we somehow end up doing things faster than we envision, we can always release also faster. It might mean that we need to provide bug fixes for an older version for a little while longer than usual, but still.
Yeah, I can live with that if we have to.
Yeah.
And also another question, how is that influencing the current templates? Will they still work with some kind of view model, and we can just pass the variables down to the templates as right now, or is there also something that needs to change?
Well, that's one of the reasons I find Mezio an attractive option because it is compatible with Laminas View. I don't claim that it will just completely work without some additional work to make everything compatible because there are possibly some pieces of Laminas MVC that are bleeding together with Laminas View. But I think likely most of it will work as is, and we may just need to, customize some view helpers or add a little bit more framing logic to make it work. But yeah, one of the goals of this project is to replace the controllers without having to completely rewrite all our views as well. And also related to that is maybe we can keep our router, though I've discussed with Ere already that we don't really like Laminas route very much, so replacing that is not off the table. But I want to look at each piece in isolation as much as possible. And so this whole proposal is designed around what is something we can do that makes a large portion of the code more flexible and more generic without breaking anything outside of it. And I at least think that this is a good place to start. Though once I actually start doing it, maybe I'll find that there are more obstacles than I am thinking of at this very moment. But I'm eager to start doing some proof of concept work and see where it leads.
Yeah,
Perhaps we don't even need magic in controllers to call the actions. Perhaps we can hook into the routing and the events it emits, so we can do that ourselves and sort of try to look for an action first, and if it doesn't work, then just delegate the work back to Laminas default method.
That's true. That's true.
Because that would make it really clean, and the supporting both methods simultaneously would be quite easy and not require any changes to the controllers.
Right. Just delete the controller methods that have been refactored.
Exactly.
And of course, the other option is that to get started with the work, we could explicitly call the new system from the existing action methods until we figured out how to wire it all up automatically. Um, or, these could be parallel efforts.
Yeah, that's true too. But looking at the code that does the execution of the routing and dispatching, it seems that it should be possible to override.
Excellent. Oh, somebody have a hand up. I don't see a hand up. I see a little icon that seems to indicate that someone somewhere has a hand up. I guess another important thing to think about is what is the best controller to refactor first as the proof of concept. I'm thinking we need something of, say, moderate complexity, maybe not something with a lot of methods, but something that does a few different things so that it's interesting enough as a test case to, make us think about some of the edges of the problem. Um, but maybe not have to think of them all at once. Uh, or, of course, we could always start with something really easy. I just feel like if we start with something too easy, we may not find the best shape and then end up having to redo work as we go. Or maybe we just bite the bullet and start with my research controller and then get some satisfaction splitting that all up.
It might make sense to start with the hard one.
Right, right. Or
At least
maybe
as long as it works out.
maybe start with holds controller because that's already been factored off of my research controller. And then if that works, there's a pattern that could be applied to slice off several more chunks of my research controller because all the request logic is similar. Um,
It would be nice to get rid of the my research term as well. So maybe we could have something like account actions. I don't know.
Well, the the vision I have in mind is that we have classes with semantically appropriate names, and then we alias them to controller action names in the plugin manager. So we could certainly uh, split these into logically organized bits, keep the my research aliases for backward compatibility, keep those routes as well. But well, actually, maybe just make the old ones redirects. That's another another possible thought. But yeah, I view this as a possible path to transitioning to a better URL structure as well, because I don't want to have a major disconnect between what's in the URL, what's in the route, and what's in the action class, because that's confusing. Um, and as I say, we can always use aliasing and redirects to keep legacy things around long enough for bookmarks to keep working and so forth.
Yeah, perhaps in the long run we don't need anything that used to be my research. It just holds checkouts,
Exactly.
favorites, whatever.
Yep.
Yeah, I was wondering if when we have figured out how to proceed, is there anything we could, any advice you could give those who are currently upgrading to VuFind 10 or then to VuFind 11, what they should do to prepare for the changes?
I think it's maybe a little early to offer advice until we have sort of the proof of concept and prototype.
Of
Certainly,
course, yeah.
I would say the general advice is don't spend a lot of time building and customizing controllers right now because it's all going to change. But fortunately, I don't feel like that's the most common or popular customization that people are making anyway, though there certainly are reasons to do it, and I'm sure everybody has at least some custom controller stuff. Um, but again, this whole plan is designed to at least make a migration path where what you're translating should remain logically similar after the transition to before, rather than requiring an entirely new conceptual framework on top of the other necessary changes. So, because that's the other goal of this is once we've proven the concept and have done some of the work to convert things, I'm hoping that we can kind of crowdsource and split up the remaining controllers and have many developers doing porting in parallel so we can get the work done more quickly and also have more people thinking about it so that if there are design flaws, there's more opportunity to catch them early and improve upon them. So we seem to be reaching a quiet time. Um, I'm certainly happy to stay as long as I need to, but it's been almost an hour, and I imagine many of you are getting tired as it has been a long day. Um, so I'm happy to wrap up here if everyone is satisfied. But I'm also happy to keep talking if there's anything yet unresolved.
Yeah, you're right about being tired.
All right. Well, thank you all for participating in the summit, coming here, all the good ideas in this conversation. I already have a few minor revisions to make to my original proposal. Um, I will try to find time somewhere to start prototyping something. And if you're interested in being involved in that, reach out to me on Slack. I'm happy to brainstorm, share work, split up the tasks, etc. Um, I'm still fairly heavily involved in reviewing stuff that needs to be reviewed for release 11, so I definitely don't have as much free time or free mental energy as I would like, but the end is in sight. It's coming together, so this will be able to be a major focus pretty soon.
Thanks, Demian. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks again for hosting and organizing.
Sure thing. So see you soon.
All right.
Bye
Bye,
bye.
Thank
everyone.
you. Thanks. Bye bye.
Bye bye.